Hello, I'm Bob Reeg. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Peace Through Action USA, and I'm pleased to continue our featured Peacebuilder series with a guest Peacebuilder, Graham Bodie. We know him through the Listen First project, but he has way more credentials than that. We're excited to introduce you today to Graham. We think he's doing some pretty terrific work to increase peace in our country, and we wanted to introduce him to you and hope that you can be persuaded from his own experience that you too can be a peace builder in your own way. So with that, we'll get going, and welcome, Graham. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, from your particularly how you discovered listening and as an area of interest for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me, Bob. So my journey, I guess, into the field of listening really began. I was a master's student at Auburn University, and I was enrolled in a required course with a professor who came in one day and said that she had a research project that she needed some help with, and I, sounded interesting. And it was the question they were trying to answer was basically how best to teach a complex skill like listening. What's the evidence that it can be taught, and what's the evidence that teaching it in particular ways are more advantageous than teaching in other ways? And I started in her office. This was back before you Googled everything. It's back when you had photocopiers that you put dimes in. And I went to her office, and she had file cabinets full of both published papers on the subject, as well as conference presentations that had never been published in a journal. And I just found it fascinating that there was this whole field of study that was uber practical and that everyone considered important. And yet we didn't know a whole lot about it. We assumed things, and a lot of and so my degree was in communication, human communication. And a lot of the theories and the principles that we find in the textbooks of interpersonal communication, for instance, come from therapy. And so the assumption, of course, is that how you listen and communicate with your friends and your family ought to be the same or follow similar principles as your family therapist or your marital therapist. And I just found that, either wildly crazy that it was that easy to transfer across context, or wildly misguided that everything that you might benefit from in a therapy session was in fact exactly, generalizable to all of the contexts that you might find yourself in as a human. And so I dove in, and that really sort of catapulted me to want to go on and get a PhD in human communication, which I eventually did at Purdue University. So I fell in love with the study of listening. I found out that this professor was the former president of the International Listening Association. She was at the time, the current editor of the International Journal of Listening. And so I went to the conference, and I met the people who I'd been reading, and just sort of fell in love with this idea that I might be able to research something and be the first one to discover some interesting nugget of information, to wrap things up that we think we know into a sort of a framework for ease of presentation and teaching. And so that really launched my academic career in listening. And so really, like much of my life, my interest in listening as a scholarly enterprise started with a relationship with someone. And it resonated from past relationships in my childhood and my formative years, of the people who took the time to listen to me and took the time to be patient with me, as stubborn as I probably was, at that point in my life. And so it really resonated with me that there were these human skills that some people seem to sort of just have naturally, and other people seem to struggle learning. And it just sort of was a motivation for me to understand and to learn more about that topic.
So a couple of ahas. First, they're proof there's an association for everything.
That's right.
Yeah, I'd not heard of the International Listening Association, but yeah, good to know they are out there.
Yes.
What was your dissertation topic?
Yeah, so I wrote my dissertation on a particular theory that explains why the same message that you might use to comfort somebody when they're distressed works in some situations for some people, but not in other situations for other people. And so we have these really robust theories of message design that suggest messages that have certain characteristics and qualities do better jobs of providing support to other people when they're stressed, but they don't always produce, mental health change. They don't always make people feel better. And the messages that we consider poor messages, again, don't always, exacerbate the stress. They don't always, fail to work. And so my advisor had been working on some explanations. And so I took, the 4 years of my PhD program to really kind of dive in to how we listen to friends and family and strangers, oftentimes when they're stressed, not about, traumatic, experiences, but this is everyday stressors, things that can mount up and produce mental health issues, things that might seem from the outside to be, benign, but as the individual experiencing it, given what has come before and what's likely to come after and the particular life circumstances, it can be a really big deal. And so what you say to other people and how you show up for other people in those circumstances is a big deal. And we often fail in those moments because we try to find the perfect words when the perfect words may not exist. And so my advisor led me through a process of literature reviews and publishing some broad scale literature reviews. And then my dissertation was a 2-study experimental test of the theory we had been developing over those first couple of years when I got to grad school.
Well, thank you for elaborating on that. I always find it interesting. A lot of people just say I'm a PhD, and kind of people don't go deeper. I was like, well, what got you that degree other than a lot of sweat?
A lot of sweat equity. That's right.
A lot of sweat and a lot of money.
Yeah.
So tell our viewers about how you move some of that into a practice-based modality, because something Peace Direction really wants to elevate is that there are techniques that work, and you're demonstrating that or documenting that there's an evidence base for listening, but we also want to make sure people know it's accessible. These are practices that work. And how are you putting some of your listening academic knowledge into practice?
Oh, it's a great question. Yes. So about 2014 or so, I got a big feature in the Wall Street Journal about some of my research, and a gentleman called me asking if I would come work with his sales team to teach his sales team to be better listeners, and not just to sell more, in this case, furniture. But he was really interested in a couple of things. One is creating an environment in his organization that I started to call a listen first culture. And secondly, to train these people to be better listeners in their daily lives. So his thought was, if they could listen better to their spouses, their kids, their parents, and so forth, that they would be better people. They would be healthier, happier, and better, workers. That they would be mentally sort of more prepared, I suppose, to work. And so he was concerned about the whole person, and so that began. I'd done some consulting before that, but that really sort of launched going inside of organizations to train different teams on principles that I had learned through my own research and the research of others on how to show up, and the fact that we often don't show up all the same, and that's okay. That diversity in listening can actually be an advantage for organizations who want different perspectives, want to bring different perspectives onto problems. And because of that experience, I was going to this particular location, this organization, several times over the course of several months. And after the probably second or third time I was there, and these were mainly men in their 50s and 60s who had been selling furniture for 20, 30 years. And one after another would pull me aside and tears in their eyes say, if I had met you 10 years ago, if I had met you 15 years ago, I might still be married. I might have a better relationship with my kids. One gentleman pulled me aside and said, I tried what you told me to do last night or last week. And my wife got home and I asked her about her day. But before I did, I turned the television off. I turned to her. I asked her to sit down and I just looked at her. And he said, 2 hours later, we were both crying, saying, why don't we do this more often? And it was that kind of that moment that again, an aha moment for me that I'm, publishing in journals and editing books is important, and I still do that work. But even more important is how do we take those learnings that we oftentimes write in very sort of academic-y, scholarly, not digestible ways for the everyday individual? How do we take that stuff and how do we show people how to be better listeners in their daily life? And through that process, I got on social media, the Luddite that I am, back in about 2014, 2015. One of the first accounts that I found was the Listen First Project. And I was so excited because they were using that same language that I had started to use, which is listen first culture, right? If we just listen first, what can we learn? These kind of things. And so I started, as Pierce Godwin, the founder, says, I started to retweet everything that they were tweeting, and I didn't know a lot about social media, so I still had a little egg on my profile. So we joked that this little egg called Graham Bodie was following Listen First Project and tweeting all their things. And so he and I had a conversation in August of 2017. 2 weeks after Charlottesville. That particular tragedy moved me and moved him in particular toward thinking about now, and I'm not saying that Charlottesville wouldn't have happened had we listened to each other. I'm not saying that everyone ought to listen to a Nazi. Like, that's not the point. I'm not going to that extreme. But I am saying that there's a role for deep conversations, meaningful conversations in the process of developing, building, and maintaining communities that are peaceful in your language, right? That in that peace building, peacemaking process, listening has a role, and I want to, as a scholar, understand what that role is theoretically, and as a practitioner, I want to understand all of the different ways we can practice showing up as listeners for peace.
What are like some fast tips for, I need to learn how to listen quick? Are there like some fast tips, or is there a primer book or something that people should go to like, okay, let me get some basics on my own? Or how do I learn how to do this better, or at all?
I'm partial to the top 10 listen first tips that are on our website. But we didn't make those up out of nothing. They come from the best practices of other organizations and other readings. But I divide this in my own writing. I call it the ABCs of listening.
Great.
That listening is first and foremost an affective or a motivational state. It's a mindset. It's getting yourself sort of in the mindset that I will show up for others, to understand, not to ram my opinion down their throats, not to win an argument, not to change their opinions or change their perspective, but to understand who this person in front of me is, and give them my full attention. So the A is about sort of attention or affective or motivational components that involve sort of the mindset of listen first. The B is for behaviors. So there's a whole host of behaviors, some of which we might know from the top 5 things good listeners do. When you Google that, eye contact, not interrupting, and paraphrasing and asking questions. But of course, each of those behaviors should be unpacked. And each of those behaviors is strategic toward the goal, again, of understanding the other person. And there's no universal set of behaviors that you ought to always do, always with all people, regardless of the situation. That active listening is more complex than simply shutting up, maintaining eye contact, and parroting back everything that someone says, which oftentimes can be more frustrating to the other person than actually useful, depending on the context. And then the C is the cognition. It's learning that we all come to situations with our own prejudices and biases, our own filters, that we filter things as we listen, we filter things through our own experiences and perspectives. And so there's no such thing as non-biased listening. There's just more or less differently biased ways of processing information. And we can try to correct for some of those things, but we can't correct for all of those things. So understanding that in us lives a host of filters. We can not always put our fingers on what those filters are. And so as a good listener, you ought to explore what the possible filters might be, perhaps what your biases what you tend toward in terms of your biases and your prejudgments, and always kind of keeping mindful that we can always do better. And so asking people, when we had this conversation, how did I do? Was I, as supportive as you needed? Was I the kind of, conflict resolution person that you needed? Was the way that I handled that situation, did it align with what you needed in that situation? And so honestly, a lot of times we can do better in our communication with other people, including our listening, by asking them, what do you need from me right now? And if you don't need advice, which most people don't, by the way, at least not before I do the work of listening and understanding, then maybe I ought to wait to give you the advice that I was going to give you and just sort of sit there and understand what you've tried, how you're dealing with and coping with the situation, and honestly feedback things to you as I understand them and ask you some challenging questions that kind of challenge your assumptions in a gentle way, not in a harsh or critical way. So again, it's really just, that mindset of it's the other person, and I ought to be, throwing my attention behind that other person. It's not about me. And it's about them, right? And so if I'm showing up as a listener, if I got that mindset, if I learn a couple of the behaviors that might be useful, but more importantly is what are the cognitive processes that are likely standing in my way of fully, attending to and understanding that person, for who they are.
Cool. And I'm going to use this as a moment to shout out that Graham was a presenter at a recent virtual learning event that Peace Through Action and Listen First co-presented on peaceful dialogue as a way to or bridging differences using peaceful dialogue. And some of the now the dots are connecting. You presented on the ABCs in that presentation. So we'll provide a link when we promote this.
Perfect. Yeah.
So people can listen to your deeper explanation of it in that presentation. Put this in a little bit of a bigger umbrella around peace building generally, like what function do you see listening plays as we all in our space try to increase peace wherever that is in our own family lives, in our workplaces, our schools, our congregations, our communities, and even our country.
Yeah, so I guess I would start that with saying, like, listening isn't a panacea, or communication or talking it out isn't a panacea. It's not going to be the only solution, as if if you just listened, then we would have world peace. That's not generally how it works. At the same time, listening and conflict resolution strategies more generally always have a place in community engagement, always have a place in peace building work. And I'm actually editing a book right now that deals with community engagement and peace building as two fields of study that on the surface take listening seriously, but if you dive deeper into the literature, what is meant by listening is oftentimes unclear, or even perhaps not fully appreciated as what it could be. And so as one example, there's a chapter in the book on trauma-informed peace building, understanding that acts of violence and other particularly war-torn regions, as we're all paying attention to Ukraine right now, for instance, the trauma that those events cause in the community that have a ripple effect and a generational effect. They don't just affect this generation, they affect multiple generations afterward. And how do you use that that understanding of trauma and helping people heal and cope through trauma with some deep listening to understand where that trauma has come from, how those people have or have not coped with the consequences of that trauma. So as one example, right, listening plays a large role in even getting a community to a place where they might engage in some dialogue, deliberation, and peace building among each other, with each other. Before they even get to that point, they've got to do work in and of themselves. And oftentimes that takes a professional, a mental health professional, a trauma, informed peace builder professional to go in and do that deep work, even months, if not years, before that community is even able to fully heal together, right? So it's just one example, but that's not the only way that listening can be helpful. Listening can be helpful in other ways as well. And so what we're trying to do in that book, and what I would recommend for any practitioners out there, peace building practitioners, is really just sort of think deeply about what it is what do I mean by listening? What do I recommend as a practice or set of practices for the peace builders that I employ, as well as the individuals who are doing the peace building work, the community members who are doing that work? What kind of practices do I recommend for them? And why do I do that? Why do I recommend these practices, right? One really common example that you'll hear is, be empathic, right? Perspective taking. And what the literature on perspective taking suggests is that it can be fruitful and it can be generative, but if all you're doing is taking perspective, in other words, imagining what other people feel or imagining yourself in the shoes of other people, you're not actually getting perspective. You're just taking it. And so what the listening mindset, or a listen first mindset, encourages is perspective getting. And so the example that I often use is, imagine your best friend's birthday is tomorrow and you want to get the perfect gift. How do you go about, right? How do you go about doing that, right? And my suggestion is not to imagine your friend opening that gift and enjoying the present, not to imagine yourself in that person's shoes opening that present and how you would feel opening that present, but literally asking them, it's your birthday tomorrow. What kind of special gift would make your day? Listening to their answer, and then, right, doing the thing in your capacity. Now, you might not be able to buy them the trip to Hawaii that they really want, but you might be able to, throw them a little shindig at home with a Hawaii theme that, encourages them to save their money or encourages them to do whatever that might get them to Hawaii one day, right? So it's a way to think about how do other people think, feel, what is their perspective? Well, the only way to really get another's perspective isn't to treat them like their mind is an open book that you can just lift up and sort of look into. It's the only way we can get here is through here, and the only way we can get here is through, right, the ears. And so our ears are our best instrument for really understanding the people and the communities that we work with.
Mary, I was just thinking, like not everyone likes a surprise party.
Yeah, that's right. I've done it to my wife twice, and that might be it for the rest of my life. One time she gave birth 3 days later, so we're
oh wow.
We're careful in those.
Yeah, at least the timing of those.
That's right. That's right.
So let's conclude with your like a dream or a wish or aspiration for the future of how listening could become more prominent, or like what's your hope for the listening field?
Yeah, when I do presentations to organizations, I start by saying a lot of business problems are problems with listening. There's about 20 hours a week, medium to small to medium-sized businesses spend about 20 hours a week correcting misunderstanding. It costs those businesses almost $500,000 a year in lost productivity because of frustration that stems from misunderstanding. And so I go through a bunch of statistics about the bottom line of businesses, and then I transition very quickly to, and it's not just businesses, it's just life. Like, what if we actually put our phones down and pushed our kids on the swing at the park when they're yelling, "Daddy, watch, Mommy, watch"? What if we actually put our phones down or turned them off and paid attention to the person in front of us, whether that was a friend or a coworker? What if we actually listened across divides? And so my work with Listen First Project, right, we're running a campaign right now called America Talks, National Week of Conversation. You're a partner in that. And a lot of the Twitter and Facebook reactions that we get when we say things like, we're all Americans, we should come together and unite to take our power back from the media, from the politicians who are trying to divide us. We know that we're more similar than we are different. Sort of these messages that sort of try to bring a common identity around a shared purpose and a set of values that we might agree on for the sake of sort of coming together in conversation. And we get reactions like, no, it's their fault. It's the, we have some, GOPs aren't Americans, Democrats aren't Americans. So my response to one person earlier this morning was, okay, so you say Democrats aren't American, and this other person says the GOP aren't Americans. So what's left is, people unaffiliated with these two parties, which is about 40% of Americans. So is that the real American? Is the independent? Well, what if they voted for Biden? What if they voted for Trump? Does that make them not American? Like, our opinions and who we vote for don't make us American or un-American. We share a country. We share this country with all kinds of diverse individuals, from those of us that are documented to those of us that are undocumented. And how do we create a world that seeks to understand how we might live together in some sort of form of peace, what we might call peace, right? And that's not that I have to agree with Bob. I don't have to agree with you on everything. I don't even have to come to lunch with you or like you, I do, but I don't have to. That's not the point. The point isn't for us to come sit around a campfire and sing Kumbaya and make s'mores. The point is to do things together. So the gridlock that we're finding in Congress, the inability for our politicians to really do anything other than raise money and to do so by dividing us. The inability for media companies to really tell us the full truth of things because they're scared that their viewers and their listeners are going to go away because they're not partisan enough. Like, these things start, in my opinion, with people resisting those types of power and taking their own sort of a bill, what they can do, and what they can do, and what I can do, and what you can do is listen to someone and try to discover why they have opinions that might be a bit different than me. And what you'll probably find, and what we found last year in the America Talks event, is 78% of the people who came found more commonality with the person they were paired with than they expected. 94% of the people that came said, I want to do that again, right? And so the naysayers, I just say, you know what, try it. If you hate it, you don't have to come back. But my gut feeling tells me that you will have a formative experience by feeling heard by someone that you don't expect to feel heard from, right? And returning that favor to them, allowing them to feel heard and understood from someone that they didn't expect to. And again, that's a great first step. It's not the only step. It's not the final step. It's not the answer, but it's certainly part of our collective solution to the problems that I think we all can agree have gotten worse over the last decade than better.
And I'll put a second plug in for America Talks Week. It happens annually. This year it's in April. I assume it's in April, years moving forward. But go to americatalks.us. It's a virtual experience, so it's accessible to everybody regardless of where you live. And we encourage you to participate this year, which is 2022, or if you're watching this featured Peacebuilder episode in some future year, I'm sure there'll be an America Talks Week, and go look at americatalks.us and find out about that. Peace or Action's super proud to be increasing our engagement in the listening space, and we're so pleased to have Graham be one of our featured peace builders, because we're trying to uplift that there's ordinary people doing extraordinary things to increase peace, and we feel you are one of those people, and happy to use you as an example for others.